Okay, Harvey Mutters, this is Professor Evans. Let's continue our quest to understand how open market operations work. I have to apologize for the long nature of the first video. I should have cut that in half. I was disappointed to see that that ran for nearly 40 minutes. I was thinking it was only going to go 25 minutes, but I could have cut it in half, talking only about the problems with the M1 and M2 money supply tracking as a lecture all by itself. For that reason, I don't want to do it again, so I'm actually cutting some of these segments down into smaller pieces. So this part 2 is not actually going to explain how open market operations work. That'll happen in part 3. This is going to provide the setup for going through open market operations in part 3. And the setup is always a little bit tedious compared to the actual discussion of open market operations. And so to motivate you, there is an Easter egg hidden in this slide set. And whoever finds the Easter egg will get some kind of credit from me. I haven't decided what yet. Now, by Easter egg, I know if you watch some of these newfangled programs like Westworld, although if you watch that, you're truly depraved. If you go onto YouTube, then you find all of these videos put up by people who are finding Easter eggs, which are mostly mistakes or glitches or intentional objects hidden in these videos. So I'm doing the same to try to motivate you to go through this whole series. I have an Easter egg hidden here. See if you can find it. Also, I apologize, at the end of that long video, I did not put the list of takeaways. It's for that reason that I have included that in this video. So let's keep going and try to figure out how it is that the Federal Reserve System is able to create copious amounts of money and credit from thin air in this economy, because that is what they do. So when I say the objective here of this lecture, I still mean this lecture and part 3, because I just took the original open market operation lecture and cut it in half to make 2 shorter videos rather than one long, tedious video. So we're going to, again, see how open market operations are conducted using the simple explanation. And when we get to it, I'll explain what I mean by simple. We're going to describe the immediate effects of a successful open market operation, and you'll find that interesting. We're going to then draw the connection between open market operations and the money and the credit supply growth rates, because those are at least candidate target variables, you may recall from part 1. Later lectures will go back and add a lot of material to the open market operation, adding mortgages, for example, repos, and other complications. And you're saying, what's a repo? I think in many cases it's best if I explain it when we finally get to it. Yeah, I know you've heard the term. It's been in the news a lot. So we'll explain what a repo is and why it fits into all of this. But that's a little more complicated than we want to. That's a complicated path. We don't want to go down that right away. Then we will talk about temporary open market operations, which are done with repos. Again, that's to be explained, and why they are necessary. And then we're going to talk at length about the impact of open market operations upon interest rates. Because remember, interest rate is, the level of interest rates, I should say, is a key target variable as well. And we know that the Federal Reserve System has interest rate targets in the form of the federal funds rate. So that deserves a lot of attention. Then we're going to talk about the role played by primary dealers, because that complicates the picture a little bit. And again, you're saying, I don't know what a primary dealer is. Well, the promise here is that will be explained when we get to it, more than once actually, so that you will understand. And then you can't understand what's going on with the Federal Reserve System without understanding what's going on now, I should say, without understanding what they did in response to the recession that began in 2008 and continued to 2009, and the recovery that followed. And then finally, we'll have a summary overview of the current changes in their policy, which are absolutely epic in scope, that has been forced by the pandemic of 2020. Now, the objective, and so this, of course, is the summary of all things that I've said right there. So here are some useful background facts about the Federal Reserve to continue to what I said before. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be autonomous from the Congress and the President of the United States. That is to say, autonomous from their influence, and historically it always has been. One of the ways that they preserve that autonomy is by being self-funded. There are no appropriations that come out of Washington for the Federal Reserve System. Instead, they take all of their operating expenses out of the interest they earn on their enormous United States Treasury bill, note, and bond inventory. And that is so much money that they return what they don't need to use to the budget of the United States. That's supposed to free them from influence from, say, the president, although again, in this particular episode, I should say, that's not so clear that that's actually happening. Monetary policy, again, this is a reminder, including open market operation policy, is generally determined by the Federal Reserve System Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. So we said that in the first. Again, we're reminding you that there is this division of judgment and division of execution and the like. Actual open market operations are conducted by the open market trading desk of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Again, we stressed this before, but I want to make sure you understand that separation because it becomes important later. And then two new pieces of information here. You don't know this. There are actually two kinds of open market operations as expressed by intent. There are temporary open market operations, which are generally also seasonal, that are done for a short period of time and then rolled back. And these are often used to help seasonal U.S. Treasury operations, and they use repurchase agreements or repos to do that. And so we'll talk briefly about why they have to do it. We won't really cover much about how they do it. And then there's permanent open market operations, which have a lasting effect. And in these lectures, we're mostly talking about the permanent effect. So the permanent effect is our current target at the present time. So what do we mean when we say open market? Why is it called that? Well, as it says here, 2 or 3 times per week, and sometimes even more than that throughout the year, the trading desk of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York indirectly enters the market for United States Treasury securities, sometimes directly, but usually indirectly, by making a bid in competition with other buyers for a given amount of some security, such as the 13-week Treasury bill for $10 million. And effectively at that point, the Federal Reserve System is simply another player in the market. Now, we'll explain what we mean by indirectly here, partly now, but partly, mostly I should say, when we start talking about the primary dealers in somewhere around the 4th lecture. But basically what this means is that they are participating in a market that everyone is participating in, and they're just another bidder in that market in competition with smaller parties. Now, obviously, they're the largest of the players in that market and to some extent dominate it, but they are trying to reward the Treasury by buying their assets at competitive market rates. So they will buy directly or indirectly from any trader making an offer or an ask or accepting their bid, including but not restricted to a private bank. So in the example that follows, we will assume that they buy from a private bank. That'll be our primary assumption. And that private bank is likely to be what we call a primary dealer. But that's not necessary for the open market operation to have its desired effect. Now, when we say indirectly, that does have to be substantially qualified, and that will happen in a later video. In the initial simple video, we're going to gloss that over a little bit and simply say that they're dealing with a private bank that is licensed to trade effectively with the Federal Reserve System directly. Now, specifically, this is what we're going to see in these open market operations. It effectively comes down to 4 steps. Now, in this video, I'll explain what those 4 steps are going to be, and you won't understand it very well because, well, how do they do this? How do they do that? Then we'll open the open market operation lecture itself, part 3, again with this slide reminding us of where they're going to go with all of this, and you'll begin to understand it. It's been my experience in the past that the first time we go through the structure of open market operations, a lot of students are still puzzled at the end. But once you're introduced to all of the jargon and what the terms mean and what specifically the transactions are, then if you loop back around through it a second time, everybody seems to understand how it works, because students have not had trouble in the past answering questions about this on an exam. So step 1 will be that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York buys United States Treasury securities from private holders. We're going to assume mostly banks, and that's mostly who they buy it from, in the open market. So they're buying Treasury securities from banks. Now, by Treasury securities, remember, we mean United States Treasury bills, notes, and bonds, which differ only in their maturity, ranging all the way from, say, the 13-week U.S. Treasury bill to a 30-year bond, initially at least issued as a 30-year bond, perhaps having less time on before the maturity because it's been out there for a while. 2, and they pay for these with reserves. So they pull in Treasury securities from the open market and they pay for these with reserves. So your first question is going to be, what do you mean with reserves? We can't explain what reserves are quite yet, and it has to actually be explained when you're doing the open market operation. They are not what people call Tier 1 and Tier 2 reserves, if you've ever heard that term before. The media is constantly making that mistake. The Congress of the United States imposed strict capitalization requirements on the banks in the United States after the last economic recession, and those requirements, which are quite burdensome to the banks, are called Tier 1 and Tier 2 requirements. This is not what we're talking about here. The reserves that we're talking about here are specific only to open market operations and are not associated at all with Tier 1 and Tier 2. When they buy these treasuries and pay for them with reserves, this allows banks on net to increase their lending. They're able to increase their lending, and that act creates credit and becomes a form of debt. So when they increase their lending by virtue of having these reserves, they're creating credit. And this creates new checkable deposits on net for the entire nation. No matter how this is done, it's going to cause a rise, at least initially, in checkable deposit accounts, mostly for corporations, but eventually it filters down to everyone who deals with corporations. And new checkable deposits are, by definition, money. Remember, when we defined the M1 and M2 money supply, we said that it consists mostly of checkable deposits and other things like money market deposit accounts. But all definitions of money include the aggregate of total checkable account balances outstanding. And therefore, if that's so, when we go back and look at the effect of the open market operation, it's going to show that we created credit, and at the same time, effectively as the same act, as part of the same transaction, we also created money. And so this means that regardless if your target is a credit growth rate or a money growth rate, you can control that target with these open market operations. So this is what you're going to see in the actual open market operation in the next video, which I'm likely to post fairly soon. Now, let's take a look at some of the key takeaways from these 2 videos. Remember, I didn't have one on the first. I should have had it at the end. I forgot to put it in there. But I'm going to include it here as the first 3, and that's from part 1. And then the second 3 will be from this video right here, or will pertain to this video. So from part one, remember the importance of the Federal Reserve System's historical mandate, that list of issues, and especially remember the two that we described as mutually exclusive at the time. And remember, that was to control the general price level and keep interest rates low. So sometimes those are mutually exclusive. And you don't quite yet understand why that's true, but you will after you see open market operations. That's why we're going through this. And you need to try to remember the indirect controls of the transmission mechanism. Remember, we said they have a control variable that they can precisely control, and with that they hope to influence a target variable that has a big impact upon GDP, and in so doing, they can actually impact the growth rate of GDP and other subordinate goals of that kind. So the indirect controls of the transmission mechanism is what I'm talking about here. And remember the connections between the control, target, and goal variables. The primary importance of that lecture, though, and that should have been treated separately as a separate lecture, I think, is why money is no longer regarded as a target variable. That is to say, the Federal Reserve does not take the money supply growth rate measured by either M1 or M2 as a serious target variable anymore. They don't even bother to discuss it in complete contrast to what they did in years past, in the 60s and 70s or so. I want you to try to remember what evidence we saw that that's true, and I want you to try to remember the role played by velocity. You know, I'm not going to ask you anything deep about that, but I am likely to ask you something about that because we need to ultimately dismiss the control of the money supply as a valid target variable because it has no connection to any of the meaningful goal variables. Now, out of this lecture, that arrow is randomly went somewhere. Out of this lecture, that's supposed to be pointing at number 4, and I didn't pull it up there. So imagine that green arrow is pointing at point 4. The general importance of open market operations in the Federal Reserve Toolkit, and so you're going to have a sense of that after part 3, and so most of this is ahead of us. But you need to understand and grasp the significance of open market operations and how powerful they are. And then, that was actually a slide that should have been deleted. So I've already said this, general importance of open market operations, and then where the major decisions are made by the Board of Governors, remember that, but where critical operations and policy execution decisions are made at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and specifically the Open Market Committee. And then finally, we will ask you to kind of understand the distinction between temporary seasonal OMOs, we pointed out that they exist, and the permanent, and again, which you don't yet understand, but you eventually will. And that does involve an introduction to the world of repos, which you will probably find interesting. Okay, at least I had more than one Easter egg in this. I had an extra slide with an arrow pointing at nothing. But I think we managed to get through this, and we managed to get through it in a reasonable amount of time. So that's it. You can expect the video on open market operations to follow very closely. If you're looking at this live or on the same day it's posted, the OMO lecture itself per se probably will come out Friday, tomorrow, or possibly Saturday after that if I can't get to it. Okay, hang in there. I hope you're doing fine out there. At least I know you're kind of bored probably. You may have an awful lot to do actually with all this effort to teach you in remote learning, but you're probably going nuts because you don't get to see your friends very much. Well, hang in there. This will end at some point, I presume. And we'll see you back soon with the key lecture, which will be part 3.